Throughout the week, we've seen reports of the burgeoning relationship between China and Russia. Secretary of State Blinken going as far as to say that China could soon provide lethal aid to Russia as it continues its war with Ukraine. But today, on the surface, China is kind of singing a different tune. The China's government releasing this document calling for a ceasefire so that peace talks could take place. The Chinese saying it's time to respect the sovereignty of all countries and abandon the Cold War mentality. The move prompting Ukrainian President Zelensky to say that he would welcome a meeting with Beijing. But can China be trusted in this? Joining us now to discuss is our panel author of Intra-Branding, the Keystone of Corporate Agility, Marc Rudov, and former Chief of Staff for the Trump National Security Council, Fred Fleitz. Fred, your take on China and whether the U.S. should be involved in this and has missed an opportunity not proposing this months ago.
That's the perfect question. Where's the U.S. peace plan? I think there's good reason not to trust the Chinese. I don't like that this plan is so heavy in criticism of so-called American meddling and Western meddling. But there should have been a peace plan by the United States months ago. We have to end this conflict. This plan has significant flaws, but I thought it was interesting that Zelensky said this is not a peace plan, but at least it's something, and he's willing to talk. I think that's very promising.
Yeah, the document released by the Chinese today, Mark, focuses on 12 points, among them resolving the humanitarian crisis, keeping nuclear power plants safe, and stopping unilateral sanctions. I didn't notice what you were doing there, but your thoughts on this?
Well, I was waving this bogus 12-point peace plan that's not worth the paper it's printed on.
Okay.
So resolving the humanitarian crisis coming from a country that welded its own citizens into their apartments so that they would die with COVID. Come on. Yeah. There's a reason that China is doing this. It's not for humanitarian reasons. It's for power and control. Mm-hmm. I believe that China wants to go in and add Ukraine to its Belt and Road Initiative. Ukraine is out of money. It's in dire straits. I believe that China wants to go in there and say to Zelensky, we will bail you out, but we will own you in exchange. We will have a beachhead against Russia. Also, it wants to humiliate Biden because Biden is doing this not for Ukraine's sake.
I think all of those are great points, Mark. Let's bring in Fred.
Doing this because he wants to go down.
Yeah, hang on, Mark. Go ahead, Fred. Respond to those. Mark making some great points there and address those because those are some real problems from this.
I think the Chinese plan has some very good points in terms of ceasefire and promoting negotiations. But Mark is exactly right. The Chinese have their own agenda. Now, Ukraine was already part of the Belt and Road Initiative before the war. And I think it's very likely that's China's objective here. It wants to lock down access to Ukraine's resources by making it beholden to China. I think that's exactly right. Yeah. But frankly, that might be something the Ukrainians would consider if that would get the Russians out of Ukraine. It doesn't sound like a great bargain to me, but when your country's being bombed and attacked every day by the Russians, it might be tempting.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark, because I guess the thing that I think is a non-starter as I look at it from what I understand, and I haven't been there, but the politics seem to be that Ukraine doesn't want to give up an inch. But what you're suggesting is China might have a quid pro quo that allows them to save face, but end up giving power to China.
But because Zelensky's in no position to bargain. Don't forget, a year ago, 9 or 10 days into this war, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister of Israel, said he was on the verge of brokering a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. And Boris Johnson of the UK and Joe Biden of the U.S. came in and said, no way, you can't do it. And if you agree to that, we're not backing you. So Zelensky was in a box and he had to fight because Joe Biden wants to go down in history as the guy who displaces Vladimir Putin. And he can't do it, and he's failing, and it's turned into a disaster. Now, there's another part of this. The United States is now very weak and vulnerable. We are upside down. Our GDP is about 26, 27 trillion, and our debt is over 31 trillion. It's unsustainable. Joe Biden has depleted the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and he has printed money like you can't believe. He has spent it. We are so vulnerable, and we can't fight a war. So China is now calling the shots.
Yeah, talk about that, Fred. I mean, all this weakness and Mr. Biden nowhere to be found, and you have the competitive superpower in China taking the lead in, I got to be honest, I didn't think I'd see them come to the table or bring parties to the table before we brought them there.
You know, Mark could be right, but I also would say that China wants this war over. It's bad for its economy. It's bad for its international influence. I don't believe the reports that China's thinking of sending weapons into Ukraine. I think that's either incorrect intelligence or something that this administration made up. And again, I think it's unfortunate that China is the nation to come out with a comprehensive peace plan, not the United States, not a European power. It is a feather in the cap of the Chinese that they're stepping forward like this. I think they're just trying to gain international influence, even if their plan doesn't succeed. But I think at the end of the day, there's a strong possibility that China wants this war over for other reasons.
Mark, 20 seconds, your thoughts.
Well, I agree with Fred that China wants the war over, but not because it wants peace. You can't take over a country at war. And it's easier to take over Ukraine if Ukraine's at peace. And NATO today offered Zelensky, if you end this war, then we'll give you arms so you can protect yourself after the peace. But it's a little bit too late, and Zelensky's in a box, and he has no choice but to let China come in and take over.
All right. Marc Rudov, Fred Fleitz. Thank you, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
You bet.